I'm your host, Hillary Bricken, and this is the Cannabis Law Now podcast, where we regularly discuss issues related to the cannabis industry, including investment, day-to-day operational issues, and potential reform on the horizon that will impact all cannabis businesses and investors in the United States. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. Today, we have Mark Hauser on, who is one of the most widely recognized leading advisors to the U.S. cannabis industry. And what's really fun about Mark is that prior to having his own advisory service to the industry, he was the head of the cannabis practice group at Reed Smith, which is a giant law firm. And he was doing deals in capital markets for 24 years. So Mark really knows his stuff, both inside and outside the cannabis industry when it comes to deal and deal making. But as of today, he is the chief of staff at Hardin, which is a well-known and really popular Nevada-based cannabis company and dispensary. And the only other thing I'll say about Mark before I let him take the mic is that he has a widely read newsletter called Cannabis Musings that he's had out since 2018. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here. I love talking cannabis law, cannabis policy. It's a whirlwind.
Well, you're definitely in good company. And today's topic for the pod is basically, given your background, which is sophisticated and also now intimately involved with cannabis, I really wanted to bring on somebody who could give the straight and narrow to folks about their kind of top 8 to 10 pitfalls and beware-alls for the industry in 2024, because I know you've seen a ton. Just right off the bat, whether it's a new listener or a seasoned vet in the cannabis industry or somebody that just entered in one of these states like Minnesota, Ohio, New York, what would be at least your first pitfall on the list for their consideration?
Well, I've been in this industry for coming up on 7 years now, which makes me both a veteran and a newbie at the same time. And I respect that. And that I know a lot of people in the industry. I know a lot of things in the industry, but there's also a lot I don't know relative to our friends and colleagues who've been in this industry for a very long time. But the one thing that I've observed, both as a lawyer and as an observer, writing about the industry, and then now as an operator on the operational side, and I tell everybody who wants to understand this industry, is that you can't rely on logic and what works elsewhere when you think about the cannabis industry and cannabis policy. Think techniques and operations and the way investors and business people think about running things in other industries and making it work, they generally don't work in the cannabis industry. Expecting the way cannabis policy is going to work, whether, particularly on the federal level, and the way the FDA or the DEA or Congress approaches this industry and deals with it. What works in some other industry, whether that's tobacco or alcohol or, consumer packaged goods or, food or beverage, it's totally different here. And I think that it all comes down to the problem that I call the quantum physics problem of cannabis, is that it's both illegal and highly regulated at the same time. And everything flows from that problem. You've got an industry that is operating completely illegally and exists purely by the grace of the federal government and the Department of Justice not shutting it down, but also is on the state level. In a lot of states, was it 34 at this point? I need to look that up. I always forget the exact number, but it is completely legal, but is incredibly regulated. And there are a few other industries out there that are so deeply regulated on the state level. Everything flows from that problem of having to sort of comply with state law, which is incredibly expensive and incredibly difficult, and then complying with illegality on the federal. And then you put on top of that it's an incredibly hot button issue. I grew up in the Just Say No era, and you've got this sort of legacy of the stigma around it, and which is still very, very much out there, and drives a lot of the politics. And so just because something is the right thing, is the right approach, or makes logical sense,
And you mentioned, obviously, the states. They're picking up the slack for the feds because the feds are half in, half out most of the time on enforcement and reform. Do you think the states are doing a good job? I know you've worked with clients across the country. Do you think the states are nailing it?
I think that most states and the regulators out there wants this industry to survive and wants to do the right thing. I think that the execution, it's hard to say that the execution in every state has been great. You've had a lot of missteps lately, certainly in New York City, and New York State is just sort of the latest example. California here, the way it's structured, it makes it very difficult. But I think if you distinguish the regulators and the people behind it in those offices from the laws themselves, I think that the regulators generalize it, but genuinely want this industry to work and are usually good to work with. But they're also, these offices tend to be understaffed. They're sort of not making it up as they go along, but don't have a lot of guidance from the regulations and the laws. And so are facing novel questions that they're just not ready for, that operators and lawyers are coming in with questions that work in other industries. For example, merging companies or, quirky ownership issues that just aren't contemplated by the regulations. Usually the regulators want to work with you to make it done. I think the problem is more on the legal side and the way the statutes work. You've got, every state has a completely different legal and licensing and regulatory. And some are flexible. Some are incredibly inflexible. You've got some states that are fully require full vertical integration and have very few licenses. Others, Oklahoma has over 2,000 licenses. I'm getting that number wrong also. I should remember numbers better. But it's thousands of licenses. And you've got states where, like Nevada, for example, the laws are fairly business friendly. And so it really is an interesting dynamic. It's hard to operate on the state level. But at the same time, I think it's more of a problem of the laws rather than the people themselves.
I think that's right too. I think it's really tough to rule make, create the law in this area with no blueprint really to look at because it's not pharma, it's not alcohol, it's not tobacco. I don't envy those regulators and I too empathize with them even if I don't always like the results of the regulatory. Now let's move on to another pitfall. I think still shockingly, but I'm inside, there's this perception that this industry is just rolling in capital and that cannabis sells itself and you don't really need brains or operational know-how. Investors will come no matter what because it's such hot, essentially contraband and should sell like a vice product. What's your take on that at this point?
Yeah, and that is definitely a myth about this industry. It's one that's proven itself wrong time and again. There are a number of folks out there who do very well and have been very successful. But I think that there has been, but I think that they're the exception rather than the norm. And there are companies out there that, that are still licensed companies that are still sort of, making it work by selling into the the illicit market as well, and the unlicensed market. And so, that there's a lot of rumors about that. It's hard to sort of prove any of that, but that remains a big problem. But look, I think, the focus here is, and I guess my takeaway is that, look, cash is king and liquidity is the most important thing for any cannabis company. And the reason is because cash is really hard to come by. And when I talk about cash, I mean, cash generally, not physical cash. Back when things were from the sort of 2016 to 2019 period, this industry was flooded with investment, particularly equity investment with companies going public on the Canadian Securities Exchange. Valuations went through the roof on sort of crazy speculation on these stocks, and companies raised millions and millions of dollars with barely a business plan. And they're similar to what happened in the first round of the dot-com boom. And in about mid 2019, stock prices came crashing down and liquidity just completely dried up. in both the public and the private markets. And it never has really recovered since then. There's been a rise in lending. That tapered off for a while, but it's starting to come back. But that really only works for companies with a lot of hard assets, because it's hard to lend against licenses. It's very hard to lend against inventory because you can't quickly pick the stuff up and sell it. You need state approval. And so, and companies can't file for bankruptcy. So it's a weird industry to lend into. So it's capital is extremely expensive, whether it's debt or equity. And there are very few investors who are really putting significant amounts of money into this industry. You don't really have institutional capital coming in. None of the traditional institutional investors will touch the industry because it's illegal. And, the pension rules and foreign investors, pension funds and foreign investors and insurance companies and the like, who fund institutional, private equity and venture capital, can't invest in cannabis, and changing to Schedule 3 isn't going to fix that. Rescheduling probably, isn't going to fix that. I'm sorry. Safe banking, if it ever passed, wouldn't fix that. It's really hard to come by money. And so preserving cash, keeping a clean balance sheet, and managing liabilities is really, those are the companies that are going to survive.
Now, you mentioned it, so we got to open the door. Third pitfall, the feds and rescheduling, etc. Are they coming to save us? Are they going to bring a method to the madness? I think, again, there's a common misconception, and maybe it's because people are more hopeful than informed, that the feds want to regulate this and they want to bring an end to the dysfunction and the disjointedness, lack of interstate commerce, etc. What do you think?
I don't think that we're going to see any real movement anytime soon. And this industry has always suffered from wearing rose-colored glasses when it comes to federal policy. I think that rescheduling to Schedule 3 happens, but I think that's only happening because it's the executive branch doing it, not the legislative branch doing it. And it's all through an administrative process. But, safe banking. I mean, I remember conferences in 2018 where, people on stage were breathlessly anticipating safe banking passing any day now. And I've won a number of bets, unfortunately, that safe banking wouldn't pass. It's just expecting Congress to do anything that requires political capital, even if it's the quote unquote right thing to do or makes perfect logic. And going back to my first point, we shouldn't expect Congress to do anything anytime soon, because it is still such a hot button issue because it's drugs. And the people you've got particularly in the Senate, you've got a number of senators it's primarily Republican senators who really their constituency are the folks that vote in the primaries. And the folks that vote in the primaries tend to be more politically engaged and more the extremes. And that I don't mean that pejoratively. I just mean that they tend to be more hardcore. And that's on the left as well. But they're the ones who make up that, 20, 25%-ish of the country that don't want cannabis legalized. And so why would a senator spend that political capital and take that risk to legalize cannabis? And I think that it's unfortunately just this reality. The president can't unilaterally legalize cannabis. The DEA, there's questions about whether, and I'm not an expert in this, about whether the DEA could completely deschedule it. But descheduling, I wrote this in my Cannabis Musings recently, descheduling isn't going to happen without full regulation and taxation as a practical matter. I mean, they're not going to give up on taxation, and the FDA is going to want to say in all of it. Now, I think the slight wild card, which is kind of interesting, is Vice President Harris. And, she has been a champion she has said in the past that she wants to legalize. And so, creates sort of an interesting little dynamic. But then again, until unless the Democrats get rid of the filibuster, which they didn't in in 2020 when they took over the Senate, I don't know how you get past the filibuster.
Fair enough. And kind of in a similar vein, another be on the lookout for, don't take it at face value. We had a significant change to the administrative realm when it comes to agency deference and rulemaking. And some of you listening may or may not know the name of the big doctrine that everyone's talking about. It's Chevron, which is the name of a case back in the 80s that set precedents with federal courts that the court must give deference to an agency in the event essentially of ambiguity around their own rules. And oftentimes this resulted in the agency kind of prevailing bar none on the way that it would interpret its own rules, etc. It has big impact, small and far-reaching, on the livelihood of many businesses that are highly regulated in this nation. There's been a recent case that essentially overturned this doctrine. And Mark, I know you keep a beat on it. Lots of opinions around what this means for the cannabis industry. And I think our listeners would benefit from your take on kind of how to approach that, because it's very complicated and it's opaque.
My take on it, listen to whatever I think about it. Listen to the experts. And this goes to a broader, like anything else out there, there's a lot of opinions and a lot of them are incredibly underinformed. And when it comes to something like Chevron, the Chevron doctrine, and administrative law, it's something that's extremely arcane, extremely complex, and just reading the statute alone or reading the rule alone doesn't really sort of give you an answer as to how something will play out. You need to have an understanding of the way the regulatory agency works. You need to understand the case law back there. I mean, it's like a lot of other areas of law, tax law, securities law. The way the rule reads has very little to do with the way it's actually practiced. This is one of those areas where, you particularly if you spend any time online on social media looking at, people trying to prognosticate what it means, most of them are wrong. And there's a lot of non-experts giving advice in this space. And so, I try to preach that you really need a cannabis law is so difficult because it is so new and because it has to thread this needle of, again, being illegal and highly regulated at the same time. And so, understanding something like the effects of Chevron and what it might mean for federal policy going forward, seek out the folks that actually practice that area of law. Don't just listen to somebody who was a deal lawyer. Try to understand, such as myself, try to understand what Chevron could actually mean.
Yeah, I think that's fair advice. Administrative law is its own animal, let alone layering in the complications of cannabis and what it's going to mean with the federal government, which I don't think anybody really knows the answer there anyway. Another area, kind of moving along in our little pit of despair here about what to look out for, but these are good things. People should be aware of them. In my experience, still, again, shockingly, 14, 15 years in, seems like cannabis operators, because they're in direct violation of federal law, they believe that they have a license to violate every other law, and that maybe enforcement isn't watching. And I don't mean law enforcement, I mean the SEC, other state laws that could apply to the way they're running their businesses, how they're treating their investors. In your experience, have people ignored those to their detriment? And can you maybe give some examples?
Oh yeah, no, this is somewhere where you should be listening to a deal of a corporate lawyer, such as yourself, I used to be a lawyer. But that is such a big problem, and it remains a problem in this industry. There is the industry, as you said, is so used to being illegal that it kind of figures, all right, well, what's being a little more illegal going to hurt things, and it has this sort of renegade attitude towards fiduciary duties. It would keep me up at night seeing companies self-dealing, affiliate transactions, keeping relevant information from investors, things like that, not sharing The fact that, such as the fact that a supplier or the owner of the building happens to be the CEO. Related party companies that are set up and transact with the main business so that they're sucking economics out of the deal. It is it remains, stuff like that remains a big problem. And I still see it. And it really, what it means asking the right questions as an investor, as well as somebody who wants to do business with somebody else. It matters. It means asking the right questions as an investor. What kind of affiliate transactions do you have? What kind of controls? What does the board look like? What are your standard operating procedures to comply with law? And so in making sure the basic fiduciary duties that a company needs, that a board and the executive team need to follow, are being followed.
Oh, yeah, I'm kind of sighing in consternation here because of the federal legality and the fact that the states, they are making it up as they go, even if it's the good old college try, but the regulators are not necessarily paying attention to those particular issues because, again, like administrative, right, corporate transactional is its own animal with all of these checks and balances, but that's not going to carry water with a cannabis regulator. The companies are kind of on their own. And I do think because of that, it still attracts this element that I really hope will be winnowed down as the years progress. And I think that's everybody's problem in attracting investment to the industry, basically changing the image of the industry to more mature and trustworthy, I think would be helpful on the whole. Now, here's another little interesting one, which I agree probably a red herring at the end of the day. Back when I first started in the practice, the major concern was this idea of quote unquote back then big marijuana versus your craft, your mom and pop companies that are starting from the ground up, generational farmers, etc. Do you think that is actually an issue, and is it an issue today as we're now kind of seeing these democratic experiments play out? Because to me, I'm just seeing a lot of failure across the board generally, regardless of size. But what do you think?
I think it was also the concern was probably over. It was probably more of a concern than it actually was. You've got big companies have had just as the same kind of financial difficulties that small companies have had. Very few large companies still make an actual net profit. They've EBITDA, but they don't make an actual net profit. Just like a lot, most small companies don't make an actual profit. Not the same, but a lot of the same challenges that big companies face apply to the small ones as well. Whether it's the impact of taxes in 280E and having to comply with law, to the fact that brand loyalty is still really hard to come by. Supply chains are difficult. Testing remains a bottleneck. All the big stuff that makes this industry so difficult to work in. Everybody has those problems. And so, the part of the difference is that when you are a larger public company, access to capital is a little easier. But again, it only gets you so far. And I think that you still see a lot of concern that big cannabis is going to drown out small cannabis in the long run. And I'm less of a proponent of that. I think that there is still, even with large, once we someday see interstate commerce and federally legal cannabis, I still think that there is going to be room for the small producers who are providing some, craft cannabis to the, for lack of a better term, the cannabis connoisseur, or if you want to be smart about it, cannabis snob, that really are focused on a higher quality, more distinctive product. And that's okay. I mean, we have that with lots of other things, where I think that it will be the harder place to be will be that middle where you've got, and sort of the mid-sized company that has sort of one foot in each of those areas. That I think will be a bit more of a challenge. But I think that the industry and the opportunity is big enough for both.
I hope so. And I think you're right. If alcohol is kind of any indicator, which it may be, those consumer habits are just really tough to nail down in cannabis at the moment. Any reliable data, I'd love to know. And let's talk about another boogeyman. This one might be real. I'm not quite sure. This is a very divisive, polarizing topic, really depending on who's speaking and what they advocate, how they read into these things, is another pitfall to cannabis, the cannabis industry as a whole. This idea of competing with these hemp derived intoxicating cannabinoids that have now sprung from the bosom of the 2018 Farm Bill.
I recently wrote in my musings that, to me, rescheduling is not the biggest thing facing or biggest thing that's going to happen to cannabis. Because to me, it will, rescheduling really will just make taxes, will reduce taxes and make everybody's balance sheets a little cleaner. Hemp derived cannabinoids, THC and the like, that to me is the biggest issue facing non hemp cannabis right now, because it is, you've got, on the one hand, you've got the licensed industry that is working through, again, this sort of state regulated, federally illegal process and all of the hair that comes with that. And then you've got, from a consumer perspective, a substantially similar product, maybe not identical in all ways, but some of the products are indeed identical, that you could buy at Total Wine or at a sports arena or at a gas station. And, a lot of it's tested, some of it's not. Some of it you can buy over the internet with a click, without any sort of adult signature required. And it's all through this loophole in the 2018 Farm Bill. The biggest question that nobody knows the answer to at this point is whether that loophole is going to get closed up in the upcoming Farm Bill that's being debated right now. There's been some amendments proposed to the draft Farm Bill that will indeed close it up, and basically, for lack of a better term, eliminate a lot of this industry, the hemp derived cannabinoid industry. What's also being referred to as intoxicating hemp, which is probably, not a fully accurate term. There's not really a good way to describe it, or sort of a succinct way to describe it. But if it doesn't, then the licensed cannabis industry has a real problem, because now it's not just competing against the illicit, unlicensed market, but now it's also competing against the hemp derived market. And, there isn't really great data out there yet, but I think that most licensed operators would tell you that it's hurting sales. It's hard to sort of, think, figure, otherwise. And so, I think that if the Farm Bill doesn't close this loophole, I think that you're going to see a lot of more licensed cannabis companies pivot, because they would have to. I think it's just, in this situation, just kind of force that hand.
Yeah, it's not ever something I would have predicted or foreseen. That's for sure.
No, I mean, it's interesting that, the two industries after the 28th Farm Bill really sort of split, and sort of naturally, because the CBD, hemp derived CBD, was really the focus. That sort of, sort of fell apart because the FDA never did anything about it. But now, but then hemp derived cannabis, THC, sort of became the thing.
It also, I think, well, from a policy perspective, what I would really like to know, because CBD was marketed, for better or worse, right, in violation of federal laws, as medicinal in nature, and had these curative effects for various ailments. But now it's kind of been perverted into the fact that you can get high, quote unquote, from these cannabinoids. And I would just like to know, has the consumer sentiment shifted where people were never really that interested in CBD? It really always has been about maybe getting stoned, and this is the way to accomplish that. So again, when you look at cannabis from the federal policy perspective, is it medicine? Is it a party instrument? I don't know. I mean, this is fascinating and frustrating at the same time. But and there's no good answer. It really will come down to Congress and enforcement and what the states do. And the states are starting again to pick up the slack to regulate it in a number of different ways. I mean, talk about a patchwork quilt of headache that's being born, I think, at this very moment. But with the last minutes that I have you, I think kind of the last pitfall awareness, don't hang your hat on this maybe, or don't get your hopes up too high. I want to talk about the Canna Provisions case, which I think at the outset of the year, people were getting pretty hyped for what this case could mean for a number of reasons. Number one, facts and circumstances have changed from the last big kind of federal enforcement constitutionality of the CSA intrastate since the last case back in the early aughts is quite different in that it's Boies Schiller, and these are very, very well-seasoned constitutional appellate attorneys that have gotten huge decisions before the Supreme Court in support of essentially civil liberties. Do you think we should be putting stock into this case? And if you do, or even if you don't, what does it mean for the industry?
I've been less optimistic than I think the average industry person about this case. It's, I'm always heartened by the ingenuity of folks to try to figure out, how do we make life easier? How do we deal with fit us, into the system and the regulations and structure that we have, the cards we've been dealt. Sorry for mixing metaphors there. Canna Provisions is one of those. It's sort of trying to figure out, all right, well, how do we thread this needle and make a credible argument that, the Congress shouldn't be regulating intrastate commerce, which is sort of the heart of the Canna Provisions case. I don't think that this is going to be successful, even though I love the fact that people are trying to do this. But I don't have a lot of expectation for success because one, the law firm and the companies that are behind Canna Provisions started working on their argument and to try to find some sort of path for over a year before they filed the case. And what they filed was much narrower than what was sort of originally pronounced and sort of originally in the original sort of press about it. It was sort of originally touted going to be that they were going to focus more on constitutionality generally. And instead, it's more just an attack on the application of the Controlled Substances Act within on an intra-state basis. So it's a much narrower, and then it's focusing on a policy argument that in earlier Supreme Court precedent no longer makes sense, which is a harder thing to pull off. And then, so it would have to, this case really needs to get to the Supreme Court in order for it to be successful, in order to overturn Supreme Court precedent. And so, fewer than 1% of cases that go up for cert are actually accepted. So you've got an extremely, narrow window there to actually make it work. And then you have to convince even to get to the Supreme Court. And then you have to convince the Supreme Court to bother to overturn its own precedent based upon what's effectively a policy argument. Now, you do have and they've sort of latched on to Justice Thomas made a comment a number of years ago in a dissent that, that the earlier case law, earlier precedent doesn't make sense anymore. So, that sort of was the spark for the idea from what I understand. But I don't think that we should, it would be great if we got it, but I don't think we should expect a success here. That's just my 2 cents. But then again, I'm not a Supreme Court lawyer. I wasn't a Supreme Court lawyer. And, I spent a lot of time on the constitutional issues, but, keeping to my prior arguments of listen to experts, I would call myself an intermediate expert on this. So seek out other advices, such as yourself. Seek out other, talk to people like Hillary here.
Oh, no. Mark is about qualified as I am on something like this. Again, highly specialized. But I think the bottom line is, folks, probably don't bet the house on the results of one litigation matter. And especially one like this that has quite a ways to go before it would even make it right to the big stage. Mark, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast and giving us the ins and outs of these pitfalls and red herrings. I love doing these things and putting people on notice. I think it's hugely helpful. And folks, if you're still listening, please sign up, subscribe to, receive Mark's newsletter, Cannabis Musings. You will be better off for it. Again, Mark, thanks.
Thank you.
And that concludes today's episode of the Cannabis Law Now podcast. Until next time, stay alert, stay alive.